Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Festa. Thanks for being with us. Today, I'm joined by Austin Jenkins, who covers infrastructure in the disruption industry for Pluribus News. Over the last year, Austin's disruption beat has increasingly focused on the emergence of artificial intelligence. I doubt that I'm the only one who was equal parts amazed and totally freaked out after spending just a few minutes messing around on ChatGPT, which debuted nearly 15 months ago. It's hard to believe. Ever since, industry experts, pundits, and politicians have been heralding AI's ever-expanding potential for advancing humanity and helping us live better lives, and at the same time, warning us of the non-zero chance that it could cause catastrophes of society-altering scale. Austin's reporting has increasingly brought a microscope to how states are leading the charge to regulate artificial intelligence in lieu of congressional action, and he's here to help us catch up and take a look ahead at the bills bound to pop up all over the country this year. Austin, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I think it's safe to say that we've got a bipartisan consensus at this point concerning the need to advance some sort of AI legislation, right? But at this point in time, we've seen very little progress or action at the federal level. This sort of congressional inactivity naturally leads to states forming their own laws when it comes to something like AI, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you hear that repeatedly from state legislators. And you're right, there's bipartisan interest and concern about this technology. And while there's been a lot of talk in Congress and proposals, and there's keen interest and concern there as well, the state legislators know that just the pace at which Congress works is not going to work for them. And the reality is, even though getting a bill through a state legislature is still a fairly arduous task and the majority of them die, the reality is state legislators can actually move pretty quickly when they want to do something, especially when there's bipartisan interest and support. And so I think the feeling is Congress will not move quickly. Legislators or state legislators are interested in this topic and feel that there's some urgency, and they're not going to wait around to see what Congress does. They're going to move ahead.
Yeah, and on that point, you wrote a really great roundup of the latest AI legislation for Pluribus News near the end of last year that I'd love to unpack for our listeners at length if we can.
Absolutely.
In it, you mentioned that there's a whopping 170 AI bills across 18 states that were either pre-filed or are carrying over from last year into this year. Without getting into any of the specifics of any given bill just yet, what issues do states seem to be prioritizing so far?
Yeah, and I expect that number has increased since then. The
Definitely.
volume, as I say, is and the pace is picking up. So there's sort of these broad categories or buckets that I would put these AI bills into. One would be what you might consider kind of comprehensive AI regulation efforts to try to corral AI generally, or generative AI. And we're seeing bills already emerging, for instance, in Virginia and Vermont. I expect to see something from Senator James Maroney in Connecticut, who's been working on more of a broader framework. There's also sort of within that bucket, there's a focus by some lawmakers on automated decision-making or algorithmic discrimination. There's a bill from Rebecca Bauer-Cahan, a state assembly member in California, that was introduced last year and will likely be back again this year. There's a bill here in Washington State, where I'm based, that's also focused on that. And then there are bills to create task forces and study groups to look at AI, but not necessarily to regulate it yet. Another bucket would be, and this is one that's really trending right now, is around deep fake videos and audio. And this has just gotten much more momentum even in the last week or so because of the Joe Biden robocall, the fake Joe Biden robocall in New Hampshire right before the primary, where he's telling people to wait to vote till November.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So these sorts of deep fakes are, especially in an election year, have lawmakers very concerned. And so we're seeing a raft of bills to address deep fake electioneering, either to ban it or to require disclosure if AI is being used. And then also within that deep fake category, there's a lot of concern about child sexual abuse material and also revenge porn. So the ability to create images or manipulate images of a sexual or pornographic nature. Those are kind of the big broad categories. There's also sort of some specific applications. I know we're going to talk about a bill in Tennessee in a little bit here, but there's in California, they're concerned about AI cloning actors In Tennessee, they're concerned about AI cloning songwriters. And in New York, they're concerned about AI cloning models. And so there's, these specific areas of concern and application, kind of depending on the economy, the particular economy of some states.
I got you. There's a couple things that I want to pull out from that. First, just because it's something that I actually hadn't heard about, we're recording this on Wednesday, January 24th. I hadn't actually heard about yet this morning the Biden robocalls. Can you tell me and our listeners a little bit more about that? What happened? How did it resolve? Obviously, it raises major concerns for what might be down the road in terms of,
Sure.
political deepfakes and things of that nature.
Yeah, so apparently this was a call that some voters in New Hampshire were getting right on the eve or the day before, or 2 days before the primary. I think it was the day before. And apparently it sounds like President Biden, he's using the word malarkey, which he's known to use, and he's essentially saying, don't vote in the primary, save your vote for November. Now, the Attorney General's office, it sounds like, is investigating and trying to determine if, in fact, artificial intelligence was used. We do know that there are programs where you can take just even with a few seconds of somebody's recorded voice, you can go in and start to put words in their mouth, literally. And what's interesting is there was a state legislator in Michigan who last fall, but last year, is as part of a hearing on her bill, which is now passed and been signed into law to place some guardrails around election deepfakes. She actually presented Joe Biden saying things about endorsing her bill. And this is something that she said was essentially done in 5 minutes using a program that was available online.
Wow,
to,
that's crazy.
to make him sound like he was, and I heard it sounded very authentic. It sounded like he really liked her bill. And it was absolutely fake. So this kind of the ease and access of this technology now available really to anybody with a computer to be able to take somebody's voice or likeness and turn it into something, a message that they didn't say, that day has arrived. And we are now heading into it's a big election year, high stakes election year. And I think there's growing concern and anxiety about how AI could be used to manipulate voters.
We had a professor named Joe Amadeus on the show maybe 6 months ago out of Montclair State, I believe, that was telling us all about these different new technologies and formats for, creating digital versions of yourself, I think he was calling it. And he showed us in about, like you said, 5 minutes, how he could make basically, indistinguishable copy of his voice just by entering a couple of sentences, recording a couple, different phrases and intonations, things like that. And if that was 6 months ago with how fast this stuff is moving, I can only imagine how much more that technology's advanced between now and then.
Yeah, and so there can be nefarious use of it, but there could also be candidates who want to use AI. In fact, we've already seen some examples of candidates and political committees wanting to use AI instead of real people or real actors or real scenes. Again, one of the areas of focus here with this legislation is not necessarily to ban it, and there are some concerns, I think, around the First Amendment and what sort of legislation can stand up to legal scrutiny. But certainly, the disclosure piece seems to be emerging as a kind of a way to approach this. That if you were to use AI in your ad, you would need to disclose it. Another approach is to prohibit it within 30 or 60 days of an election. So sort of different approaches, different ways to do this. But generally, there is growing awareness that this is going to be increasingly a factor in elections.
It definitely seems like it's going to be, continuing to advance. And I would imagine states are also changing how they approach this legislation as the legislation is evolving, which sounds like a really hard nut to crack. But why do you think some states are choosing to target specific issues rather than the comprehensive approach that others might be taking? Is either approach, gaining traction, or has it been more varied or geared to different industries like you mentioned?
Well, to your point, I think in many ways legislators are kind of building the airplane as they fly it. They're still trying to understand what artificial intelligence is, what generative AI is, and what the implications are. I mean, I'm not sure that the people who are creating these AI chatbots really understand their own technology. I mean, it learns as it goes, right? Massive data gets hoovered up, vacuumed up, and then these data sets learn as they go, or these chatbots learn as they go. So there's this steep learning curve for policymakers. And then there's sort of the question of, well, what can you accomplish in short order, especially, in one session? A more ambitious legislator may say, hey, I think we can do some framework legislation here. And one of the models that they would be looking to would be data privacy, which is now passed in 13, 14, 15 states, I think. And so, for instance, Senator Maroney in Connecticut, who is a veteran of the privacy wars, may have the confidence to be able to introduce and try to get his colleagues to embrace more of a comprehensive AI framework bill. In other places, I think that thinking is, let's go after maybe some low hanging fruit. Let's go after something very specific where either our constituents or my fellow colleagues, if you're a state legislator, are aware that this is an issue, deepfakes, for instance, and let's go after that because we know that's happening. We can identify it, we can explain it, and it's a more targeted approach. I don't know that there's a one is better than the other. I think it just sort of depends on what legislators are concerned about and what they think they can get done.
Yeah, and you mentioned him again, so let's zoom in on it a little bit if we can. Senator Maroney's working group, the Connecticut Democratic senator. What's going on there? And I know he's a veteran, like you mentioned, of the privacy wars. How is that informing his approach?
Well, and this is also really interesting. And it gets back to this idea of Congress not acting.
Hmm.
Not only are state legislators sort of stepping into that breach, whether it's on data privacy, on trying to regulate social media around kids and online safety for kids,
Hmm.
or on AI. In Senator Maroney's case, he and some other lawmakers who had worked together and shared notes on privacy related legislation got together this fall in an informal way and started meeting virtually. And this is Democrats and Republicans from red states and blue states. And I think by the end, they had 60 to 100 state legislators who were
Wow.
participating in this. And they were learning from and hearing from experts on AI. They were learning from the companies and the people who were inventing this stuff. And then they were also talking to people from kind of civil society advocates, privacy, consumer advocates, trying to get some better understanding and then also trying to get some common definitions. Because one of the things they learned doing data privacy is that, the pushback you're going to get from any entity that's being regulated is they don't want a patchwork of laws.
Right.
And if you are going to go state by state, it helps to have at least some uniform definitions. The other part of this was the idea that if you work together and have communicated state to state, that then when you get into the lobbying fights, maybe industry isn't playing states off of each other. Maybe you can be a little more sophisticated. I think that was part of the thinking too. But really, what I think is so interesting is, in essence, what this is state legislators freelancing in the moment, right? Because normally they just get to legislate what's going on in their state and they can be very focused and siloed. In this case, they're looking beyond state lines
Hmm.
and creating these ad hoc coalitions to try to get up to speed and to work in some concerted way to, coordinate. Maybe not, and as Senator Maroney will say, they're not going to come up with the same legislation and they're not all going to agree on what solutions to go after, but it might be helpful to have some common definitions and some common understanding. I keep saying this is my refrain is, if there's a PhD candidate in political science looking for a thesis to work on, I think this is an interesting one. The state legislators getting super creative about how to regulate in spaces that would normally really be the domain of Congress, right? Because it's trying to establish rules that are going to cross state lines or work for, regulate industries that serve customers across state lines. And yet now we're doing it state by state. So how can you do that in a smarter, better way, even if it's not optimal or ideal? Well, trade notes.
Yeah, there's a freebie idea for any of our doctoral students that are listening if they want to pick that up for us.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of, bipartisan cooperation going on, which is always great to hear.
And rare. Yeah. I mean, it's not in these polarized times. I think that is worth, maybe putting a punctuation mark on. I mean, generally, my observation in state legislatures anyway is that, they kind of, Democrats and Republicans can agree on about 80% of what they're doing, and
Sure.
they fight like cats and dogs over about 20% of it. But in this particular instance, yeah, we are in super polarized times, and the two parties seem very, very far apart. But on these technology issues, there is remarkable bipartisan interest, conversation happening, again, even if they might approach things a little differently.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. Are you noticing any differences in how Democratic and Republican, either politicians or states, are approaching AI legislation?
It might be a little early to confidently discern that. I guess I would say generally, I'm seeing more interest from Democrats right now on the kind of comprehensive approach, and certainly a lot of concern on the part of Democrats around algorithmic discrimination. That's
Mm.
something that Democrats really are worried about is the potential for AI to discriminate, especially in critical or consequential decision making situations. So, for instance, if AI started to make decisions about bank loans, or around housing or healthcare, the potential for the data that's being used to be already sort of flawed and then start to make discriminatory decisions. So that seems to be a big concern for Democrats. I get the sense that Republicans are particularly concerned, although I don't want to leave Democrats out of this, but they're very concerned about the use of deepfake pornography, revenge porn. Just seeing a lot of those bills in red states, but not exclusively red states. I think Republicans generally would probably are interested in a light touch
Mhm.
and supporting the potential economic development here. But frankly, you're hearing that from Democrats too. I mean, the governors of New Jersey and New York in their state of the state addresses were very bullish on AI's potential and wanting to grow that in their states and encourage the industry while also putting in some safeguards or guardrails.
Yeah, and this is one that just kind of maybe came to mind, but I would imagine, some states over here on the East Coast where I'm at, so much of tech is dominated by the West Coast. Do you think that maybe some of these East Coast states or elsewhere in the country are keeping that in mind with this emergence of this new industry?
States generally see a lot of opportunity here. So there's the potential to incentivize AI in your own state. There's also the global competition of wanting to have this happen here and not in China, for instance. So, yes, there's that. I will also say that a lot of the AI legislation we're seeing is emanating from California, no surprise. There's just so many state legislators that are interested in this, so many bills being introduced. So, in that sense, like it really, it hits home in a state like California, home of Silicon Valley. You've got the governor who's done an executive order. He's got a lot of his agencies looking at both, again, ways to use AI and also to put guardrails on it. But I think, California, New York, Connecticut, states that have done data privacy are very likely states to maybe lead on AI, Virginia potentially. At the same time, there's also these surprises like Vermont, where there's a couple of very interesting comprehensive AI bills that have emerged from a state legislator there. And you wouldn't think it, except they like to, they do say that Burlington is a little tech hub, and they've actually led on AI. They had one of the earliest state task forces, and they've shown a great interest in AI. And so don't count out the smaller states too.
We certainly don't have time to dive into more than a handful of bills, but I'd love to run through a sampling for our listeners to get a sense of what's developing. I found the newly introduced legislation out of Tennessee aiming to protect musicians and songwriters from having their voices appropriated by artificial intelligence particularly interesting. We saw these sorts of concerns drive, at least in part, the strikes in Hollywood last year. What does Tennessee's bill do, and why is it so important?
Well, first off, it has a great acronym. This is the Elvis Act, which stands for Ensuring Likeness, Voice, and Image Security.
That's catchy.
And the governor unveiled this in a recording studio in Nashville. There were luminaries from the music industry that were in attendance and who spoke. And really, what they're proposing to do in Tennessee is to build upon existing law that protects and really came out of Elvis being impersonated, right? His likeness being monetized.
Right.
So there's a Tennessee law that already protects musicians and well-known people sort of in that sense. This would extend that law to include voice. So songwriters, musicians, and singers trying to make sure that AI can't come in. And we're already seeing this again, like with Taylor Swift, AI can make up a new Taylor Swift song and make it sound like she's singing it. So this reality is here. So this law intends to try to protect artists in Tennessee. I mean, we know it's the home to country music, it's the home to jazz and blues. It's a huge part of their economy. But what's also interesting is that they see this legislation as something that potentially could be exported to other states. And so that's something else I would be watching for, is if one state does something like this, does it get noticed by and picked up by other states? So this is one to watch. And I mentioned before that, it's New York is looking at how to protect people who are in the modeling business. You alluded to the fact that in California, they're concerned about AI with actors and voiceover artists. The contract that they finally agreed upon, the SAG-AFTRA contract, has some language around that, but there's also legislation that may be considered in California.
Yeah, and coming back over here to New York, there are dozens of AI measures that have been introduced, but you referenced a meta dilemma in that article that I found interesting. They can't, and it might sound a little funny to our listeners, but they can't agree on whether or not they should allow AI to assist them in writing legislation. What's the story there?
Yeah, this is interesting. And this also gets at sort of this isn't all about stopping AI or, the potential downsides of AI. There's a huge amount of interest in how to use AI. State agencies and state governors that through their AI executive orders are actually instructing their agencies to do two things: evaluate to the extent to which they are already using AI, make sure that if they're doing so or if they're going to do so, that they have some protections in place, but also to look for ways to employ AI to deliver services better. But there is this question that's arisen and a bit of a debate, it seems like, in the New York legislature about whether it would be appropriate when drafting bills to perhaps start with querying ChatGPT. This has already been done sort of to just prove the point that it can be done. And we've seen that in some other states too. The question becomes, is that appropriate for staff to do? Is it appropriate for legislators to do or not? And if you do it, do you have to disclose it? Now, I think everybody would agree you should not just draft a bill using a chatbot, an AI chatbot, and then submit it. You would want to check it, have human review, and probably rewrite it.
Definitely.
But we have to ask this question of our school kids too, right? Is it okay to start a school assignment by querying AI? I'm the parent of middle school kids. I'm not sure how I feel. I would say I'm not there yet. I think I would think that was cheating, but their view is, well, why wouldn't you at least use it as a starting point? So, there may be some generational divides here. Some are going to be more comfortable with it than others. It doesn't sound like there's a hard and fast rule in the New York legislature, just sort of a difference of opinion. I would say if you're a lawmaker or a student using AI to facilitate your work, you should be transparent about that. That's just my recommendation.
Yeah, well, to take some slack or some heat off your kids, I definitely use it from time to time, right? Like when I'm taking notes to get ready for an interview, it's pretty common that I'll run those notes through something like ChatGPT and say, hey, can you help me think about the direction to go with this interview, or, maybe how I should ask about this specific thing. So it does, I think, serve its purpose as a starting point. As somebody who used to be a teacher as well, the first time I heard about it, I was like, oh, kids are going to be using this for every assignment that's out there. But
Right.
I would imagine it'll get to a happy medium at some point.
Well, and it's funny you say that because there's a bit of a generational divide between you and me. So I really do think you have to, the comfort with adopting these new technologies and trying them out. It's not only about one's age or station in life, but that is certainly a recurring factor, I think.
Sure, yeah, and I think that'll definitely play out as well in how these bills develop and the certain issues they might target. But what other bills are catching your attention, if any? Any others that come to mind?
Yes. There's just so much happening in this space. We've talked about the comprehensive AI regulation. We've talked about the deep fakes, both election related and pornographic or sexual in nature. We've talked about executive orders from governors. And then there's sort of this other category, which I've alluded to, but I can be more specific about, where there's an effort to promote the use of AI. And let me just give you a couple of examples. This is not necessarily legislative in nature, but in California, for instance, the LA Times reported recently on how they're looking at using AI to make the roads safer, thinking about traffic management and just, what are the potential benefits here as we're trying to get people where they need to go. In Hawaii, there was a recent story about how, they had the terrible fires in Maui, and now they're thinking about, could AI help fire forecasters in the future predict and respond to fires. In fact, AI has already been being used in the western states and the Mountain West to try to spot fires early. There's a bill in Kentucky to encourage the use, to going back to what we were just talking about, to encourage and promote the responsible use of AI in schools. And in Pennsylvania, Route 50 just did a story about how the state of Pennsylvania is partnering with OpenAI. It's a first in the nation pilot to encourage state use of ChatGPT and OpenAI technology. So there's, a lot happening in this space of sort of in the exploration or pursuit of AI arena. Just a couple other things I'll mention. South Carolina has created a brand new standing committee on AI, which clearly speaks to the concern and the interest and the fact that they think it deserves its own committee. That's notable, I think. And we're just seeing a lot of focus on studying it, task forces, trying to get arms around what this is, what the potential upsides are, and what the benefits are. So while I think we'll see a bunch of legislation passed this year, I think it's also fair to say that there's a lot of studying that's going to be done over the next couple of years in states around AI to try to figure out what the best path forward looks like.
Right. Yeah, I saw that some of the task forces that are being put together right now are mentioning that they are going to try and develop things across the course of this year, but won't really have things to share until next year or somewhere as late as 2027, things like that. And
absolutely, yeah.
Governance isn't typically known for being a speedy operation.
That's right.
Even regarding something as urgent as addressing the emergence of a revolutionary technology like this. But, before I let you go, Austin, and thank you again, you've been great. I'm wondering, huge election year, this stuff is rapidly developing and changing all the time. You mentioned that the pace of bills has already started to pick up this year. What do you think, and I know it's hard to predict, but what do you foresee in terms of the pace with which bills are going to be put forth? And then do you think that they're going to have to be flexible at all, obviously, as we move closer to the election, if this technology is, constantly advancing and becoming different?
Well, one thing, just that by asking that question, you're prompting something I had not thought of until now, but it would be, you could imagine, you could conceive of a scenario where a legislature comes into special session to address AI deepfakes or something happening around AI in the moment. They go out of session, we're heading towards an election, and something happens. I'm not predicting this will happen or saying it will happen, but I could imagine a scenario where that would happen. Kind of a hair on fire moment, right? Let's come back into session and try to address this. I do think that the probably the biggest trend to be watching for right now in 2024 is going to be election related AI legislation, because the looming election is so front and center and in so many people's minds. Beyond that, I will be interested to see if some comprehensive AI legislation can get passed in a couple of states, which would be sort of what we saw with data privacy, where one or two states do it. With data privacy, it was California and then Virginia. And then it kind of started to pick up steam, but it takes a few years. So I'd be watching for that. And then I think beyond that, I'm interested to see if California passes this automated decision-making algorithmic discrimination bill, because that was something that was teed up last year, did not pass, will come back this year. There are some budget implications, though, for that. And California's in a big budget crunch right now. So we'll see if that has implications for getting that bill across the line. But that's kind of where I'm watching to see if those kinds of things happen. I'm also looking for, I want to see if the Tennessee bill gets through. I think it likely will. Seem to be a lot of excitement and support for that. And then I'm always waiting to be surprised by a new issue that comes up, a new bill that just dropped or introduced late in the game to respond to something that's perhaps in the news. I think with AI, we got to be super flexible. Everybody's learning as they go. And we really don't know what this first chapter of legislating is going to look like. But we know that chapter is being written right now.
Austin Jenkins of Pluribus News, thank you again for bringing us up to speed. This was great. Obviously, as you mentioned, there's a lot going on here, so we'll definitely have to have you back on the show soon.
I'd like to do that, and I appreciate you having me. Thanks for having me on.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our election coverage and Austin's work at the links in our show notes. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for listening.